Welcome again to Hack Your Hascom. My guest today is Sonia Razak. Today's topic is the 50 Shades of Grey in the SDS. And in introduction to my esteemed guest today, Sonia has been a practitioner of product stewardship, PS, for over 20 years. She's cut her regulatory teeth at the Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan, and continued to hone her skills at Huntsman, Celanese, America's Styrenics, and Nexeo Solutions, which is now Univar. And as of July 2021, she is the Global Vice President of Chemical Regulatory Compliance and Product Stewardship at Michelman. She also leads Michelman's legal department. She started her career as a QC analytical chemist at Dow, got bored, and on a whim decided to give product stewardship a try. Her regulatory expertise spans a wide range of end use markets, from pharmaceuticals and food packaging, automotive, and building and construction. Sonia is well versed in responsible care, product stewardship management systems, and is a 7-time survivor of M&A integration projects. And be sure to don't ask, but I'm sure she'll tell us. Outside of her responsibilities at Michelman, she enjoys speaking at product stewardship conferences and is president elect of the Product Stewardship Society. As a self proclaimed PS geek and proud of it, she loves mentoring junior product stewards and extolling the value of product stewardship to anyone who will listen. She double majored in microbiology and biotechnology and holds a bachelor's in science with a degree from the University of New South Wales in Australia. Wow, that is quite a background, and I'm happy to have you on as my esteemed guest. So when we were talking about coming up with topics, we had to decide on a good deep dive, the nuances of what we do at Hack Your Hascom, which is all these gray areas. And naturally, you came up with a fantastic title, 50 Shades of Grey. So talk to me more about why did we choose that? And, I'm sure we'll get into this further.
Well, those of us who've been doing product stewardship and have come and all these regulatory wonderful things for a while, we know that things are not always black and white. We want them to be, but the world isn't black and white, and certainly has come and regulatory stuff isn't. So gray seemed to be a very good title to have. And why not have some fun with this title? If anybody's watched the movies and are into the movies, you know what we're talking about. So I like to have fun with my work. And, as a presenter, like you mentioned, who wants to have a boring title? Nobody wants to listen to boring ho-hum topics. And why not make the topic interesting to grab people? So that's
Right.
that's how we came up with this, right?
Excellent, excellent. And I'm hoping our listeners today will find this useful as I do too. This is my bread and butter, and I'm sure many of our listeners will feel the same. Hope to get to some interesting topics, and of course, as always, you'll find Sonia's bio information on the website hackyourhascom.com for more information. Check it out, and be sure to visit us again. So let's get right to it here. So with some of the work that we do, we have to classify hazards. There is a concept in the literature called the weight of evidence. And briefly, or if you want to get into some data here and what it actually means, what is the weight of evidence and why do we have that option as a way to classify our hazards?
Right. So when we think about safety data sheets or hazard classifications, there has to be some way to base it on something, right? So the weight of evidence concept is an approach to decision making, and it takes into account the evidence that you have and how much you can rely on it. So when you think about that in the world of HAZCOM and safety data sheets, how do you decide what data to use to do your classifications? What data to throw out, even more important, to make your classifications? And how do you decide which one to weight more heavily than others, right? There are assumptions you have to make. There are some reliability decisions you have to make. There are some coherence assessments you have to make. There are some relevance assessments you have to make, right? Is this data relevant to me? Is this even trustworthy? What is the source? Is it actual test data or is it some modeling data? Is it an extrapolation of something versus actual things in real use scenarios, right? So the weight of evidence is really a qualitative way that we use to look at all the information available at our disposal to make decisions on classifications of hazards and things that go in the STS.
With that, is it important to what kind of background should somebody have that makes them confident that they can make a good weight of evidence judgment? What do you recommend that they should have knowledge in?
Obviously, you have to understand how to interpret data. You have to understand scientific principles. You have to be able to weigh what's good data versus bad data, what is quality data versus questionable data. And a lot of that just comes with obviously some basic education, right, which most of us will need to have, right, to do the
Mm,
work we do. But there's also some breadth of experience. I tell my children who are young adults now, there is no fast forwarding experience. There's a lot that goes into being comfortable making these decisions because many times they are qualitative and you come up with some confidence factors based on the work you've done and the success you've had. So relying on your own expertise, if you are a fairly seasoned person that has had experience doing these, is good. But if you're not, then definitely rely on seasoned, experienced colleagues. Maybe look to professional SDS authors, look to other sources who may be a little bit more confident and comfortable doing these just because of the number of years they've practiced in this area.
okay. Thank you for that. That's very important. With the data that you get out there, there's a concept of trying to find the data and how is it reasonably ascertainable where you get those concepts. And I would imagine there's some issues associated with actually finding the data in the first place. Not every chemical has the information readily available. Can you go into what it would take to get actual information?
Right. So this is the bane of our existence, right? Everything we do has to be based on data. You don't pluck information out of the air. You use the weight of evidence, but first you have to find the dang thing, right? So very often, if you're a manufacturer or a supplier of something, you rely on your suppliers, right? Because you're using raw materials to make whatever it is you're making. So naturally, you want to start there. Garbage in, garbage out, right? So whatever you're putting in is going to have an impact on whatever you're making. So relying on your suppliers to gather information for you and give you the information that you need is helpful. Looking at databases, reputable databases that are out there and publicly available is also a really good source. If you have a toxicologist on staff, or if you don't, you can still access scientific literature. That's also a good source. The bottom line is there's data everywhere, right? So reasonably ascertainable information means something that is readily available and reliable. It does not mean you have to go hunt and dig and pay money to get all of this data, run your own test. That is not what that RAI means. So being able to determine what is reasonable and ascertainable is important versus going on a goose chase because you didn't quite understand what that meant in the regulation. So
You
there's
know,
lots of things available, right,
sure,
for us.
sure.
It's just up to you to figure out what works for you and what level of data do you really need.
Right. And I would imagine you may have touched on this a little bit. Do you know if there is a regulatory interpretation or standard definition of what is reasonable? I've seen that term in all sorts of concepts and processes, but what does it mean here? And has an agency or a country or some regulatory source defined what that is?
Yeah, when I looked up, regulations in a previous life when I was a little bit more intimately associated with SDS authoring, the I think I said the definition to be reasonably, readily, and reliably
Hmm.
ascertainable, right? So something that you can find in a reasonable way without having to exhaust lots and lots of hours and time and energy and money. So again, this is where the shade of gray comes in, right? There
Hmm.
is no good definition of that. And there are different competent authorities who will give you a slightly nuanced version according
Hmm.
to their definition. So again, that's where experience comes in, right? Um, that's the shade of gray, and that's why we're talking, right? So I've given you some examples of where you can find these things. Now, one thing I want to add is if you're looking for trade secrets and you're asking your supplier, that is not considered reasonably ascertainable information. A supplier is not obligated to give it to you, and that is
Hmm.
not part of what we call REI. So
Oh,
that's a
great.
good thing to know.
Yeah, yeah, I know trade secrets are a bane to us, and I think we can circle back to that.
Mhm.
I like to tell my clients too, like when they ask about, hey, where do I get this data? Why? What is the purpose? A lot of these SDSs rely on manufacturer knowledge, and right, the basis of that is the data you have. So
Yep.
what I like to tell them is, if you're going to do your homework, you better justify the answers that you're giving, right? Whatever those may be, because somebody is going to ask you, how did you get to that answer, right? And if you can't prove that or show in your files somewhere that you've documented the citation or the source and that it's a legitimate source, then you could be in trouble. So I think that's an excellent point about, the concept of getting you to that weight of evidence that you're ultimately going to base your classification on. So great, great. And I think you talked about some of the things, you may sometimes have an uncooperative supplier who just doesn't want to give up the data. They're going to tell you, well, I've handed you my SDS. The SDS has given you everything that's compliant to some regulatory standard. Why should I give you more? What are our uh, process to get around that issue? And do you have some examples?
Well, sometimes it helps to have a circle on the wall and beat your head against it. I don't think that doesn't get you anywhere. So try that. It doesn't work, I'll tell you that. No, but seriously, what is helpful is to have a good relationship with your procurement people because usually they're the ones who have the relationships with the suppliers, right? So if you've tried and for whatever reason the supplier is not responding or not responding the way you want them to, or not giving you the data you're asking for, whatever the case may be, it is a good idea to try to escalate and work through procurement. Maybe they can highlight the importance of this information because obviously, there's a business relationship there between you and your supplier, right? And
Sure.
procurement usually tends to own those relationships. So sometimes it helps to work through them. Another thing we've done that has worked is perhaps having our regulatory department talk to the supplier's regulatory department. Sometimes when you're asking through your procurement, who then asks through their contact, things get lost in translation, right?
Mm.
So if you can have the regulatory person in your department or your company talk to your peer at the suppliers, then they understand exactly what you're asking. So, it just depends. Sometimes the sophistication level of your supplier is also questionable. Sometimes they just
Sure.
don't understand what you're asking because
Right.
there are different requirements in different countries, as you know. So when you
Hmm.
ask for something perhaps of a foreign supplier, for example, or maybe a US SDS, they just don't understand why you're asking that information. And,
Right.
and they don't want to give it to you. It's work for
Right.
them and they
Hmm.
don't see the value. So being able to talk through why it's important and why it preserves the relationship, because if you don't have information on your raw materials, you're probably not going to be able to qualify them, right? You're not going to
Right.
be able to do whatever you need to do because you don't have
Right.
regulatory information, right? So
Right.
it is in everyone's best interest that this information is handed over within reason. Um, if it's of a confidential nature, if the supplier thinks it's confidential, then obviously you need to think about having a non-disclosure agreement, and that's when you get the lawyers involved. So it just depends on what is the nature of what you're asking. Does the
Hmm.
supplier understand? And if it is confidential, then be prepared to go through the NDA path.
And even still, I would imagine after doing all those hurdles, there's still some roadblocks ahead. And if that finally happens, you may have to make that final decision is maybe not to do business with that supplier, go to
What
somewhere else.
information you're asking, right? If it is
Hmm.
information that is critical to make some sort of a regulatory assessment, then you might have to come to that conclusion. If, however, it was a more of a nice to have, you may decide to put no data available in
Hmm.
your whatever section. Now, that is not something I recommend because your safety data sheet really should be as complete and accurate as possible. But again, if
Right.
it's a non-mandatory piece of information, or perhaps you're asking just to validate something, some assumption that you have, maybe you can get away with, no data available or something to that effect. But
Right.
again, every case is going to be slightly different. So
Hmm.
being able to make that decision based on what is the hazard and the risk of what you're trying to do and how does it impact your hazard communication, whether it's on the label or on the safety data sheet, that is a judgment call only you and you can make based on your
Right.
company and the product and your risk
Right.
tolerance, really.
Right. And going back to what I said earlier, you document what you're doing, keep that on file in case somebody comes
Yeah,
and asks, right?
right.
Great. Great. So I know you mentioned some of the data you're getting from your suppliers includes the SDSs, and you may find different versions of that same SDS out there.
Oh, never,
What,
never.
never, no, in a perfect world, of course not. But we don't live in a perfect world. So with that, what do you encounter there? I've seen this myself, an SDS showing a different classification and it may be off by a couple months or different versioning or different you're saying one thing in a different country and another in the US and now what do you do? What do you suggest for us to reconcile that?
Funny that you asked because this just happened about 2 weeks ago, where we were, I think, revising our raw material SDSs, and we asked for a new version, from one of our suppliers who shall remain nameless. And we got something, and we looked at what we had from I think maybe 3 years ago, and there was a huge discrepancy in one very important piece of data. It was totally like contradictory. Let's say
No.
Tosca, something like
Hmm.
it is on the Tosca list, it is not, something to that effect. Pretty egregious.
Okay.
We were like, oh my God, what is this? Right? Because if you have a major contradiction like that, on which we have made importing, exporting decisions and other important, quality, excuse me, regulatory decisions, then that's a big deal. So we called a meeting with them and they said, "Oh, you know what? We actually went through an M&A, and what we gave you was the acquired company's SDS from the past. And of course, now that we've acquired them, we also noted this discrepancy and this mistake, so we're correcting it." So these things
Oh.
do happen, right? So, I mean, at the
Mhm.
end of the day, if you find something like that that's grossly different or wrong or incorrect or incomplete, it behooves us to go back to the supplier and because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
if your raw material SCS is wrong, everything downstream is probably going to be wrong. So having that
Right.
eye and being very judicious to not just trust exactly what you see, looking at the version, reconciling what you know of regulations and what's happening in the landscape is really important.
Great, great. And many of our listeners, we're now in the stage of here in the U.S. We're in a new version of the U.S. GHS format, and it's an update to the revision for the HAZCOM standard. And one of the things that were irking a lot of people, and which OSHA is, I know, going to be receiving a lot of questions on LOI's letter of interpretations on, is the downstream reasonable use that the manufacturer has to basically account for all uses. So if I have some, commodity chemical like benzene or something, and that's, being used for thousands and thousands of uses, you are now as a manufacturer going to have to account for that and show that somehow. Any insight into what we should do for preparing for that kind of uh, mandate that we have as manufacturers for the SDS?
Yeah, lucky for us, in Michelman, we are a specialty chemicals company. So for us, our end uses are fairly niche and we know what they
Okay.
are. So I
Okay.
don't have that problem in my company. But no, for your listeners, if you are in the commodity chemical space or, other formulations that have wide applications, I would suggest working with your sales folks to identify which are the top five, which are the top 10,
Mhm.
unless you want, a 15-page document itemizing every single way that benzene can be used. the only recourse you have is to go with logic, right?
Mm,
And like you said, if the authorities put out a LOI, letter of interpretation, or an FAQ or something, then hopefully there'll be some clarity. But absent that, you go with what logic dictates and what is reasonable.
yeah, yeah. And again, we're talking about that concept of reasonable, right? Like we spoke about earlier, and what does that mean?
Yeah.
I know OSHA was asked this when they introduced it uh, back a year and a half ago. And they basically said, we don't want you to be kind of the omnipotent God and know everything, right?
Right.
Be reasonable, talk like you just said, cover your known things that your customers are going to do, and probably change them as you see them coming. You may rely on your customers to tell you, hey, I found some new use,
Right.
and I question the classification. So it's an ongoing moving target, but I think that's the ultimate goal of what OSHA had in mind when they updated the HAZCOM. But again, they're going to tell you this was always in the preamble. This was, there. But if you see it, there's a bit of a discrepancy where they want you to outline it in section 2 of the SDS now,
Yeah.
where they didn't have to, since
Right.
2015 till now. So something to think about here. And, I think getting into that, we talked about the trade secrets, getting the constitution, how do you get the actual legitimate data? What constitutes a legitimate trade secret then, where versus something else where I need to know? Do you get anything on that? Any insight there?
Yes, for sure. In my case, I run, the HASCOM department. I run regulatory. So we have a list of things that we as a company have identified as trade secret, right? So that is the first step. You can't claim everything as trade secret,
Mm-hmm.
even though I know we want to. Safety data sheets are public documents, so whatever you put on there is fodder for, I guess, bad actors trying to, I don't know, reverse engineer and try to get secrets out of the company, especially competition. But at the end of the day, you are entitled to protect your trade secrets. But first, you need to know what they are, right? So what we've done in our company is we have a list of things that we consider trade secret, whatever they may be. And we have a policy around whether we'll disclose it, how we'll disclose it, under what conditions will we disclose it, NDAs, will we disclose to a customer? Will we necessarily go through a third party? So, we have policies around how to handle it. If for the listeners, if you don't have such a policy, intuitively your R&D, your internal folks will tell you, no, no, we can't disclose this. Well, then make sure you understand what those things are, despite not having a policy. Make sure your team knows that, and have guidelines within your HASCOM team and your authors on how to protect that. And as there are differences in how you can protect trade secrets. OSHA allows you to uh, have a trade secret, claim trade secret, but you have to have substantiation, right? And you have to disclose a generic name, and you have to have a statement there that says this is a trade secret. In Canada, you have to actually apply for that, right? The HMIRA number. So again, understanding what the practices are around trade secrets in the various jurisdictions that your products are sold into is key because you can't do what you're doing for OSHA in Canada. That's not allowed. And then similarly for CLP, they also have rules around claiming trade secret. You have to submit an application, there's a fee, there's time involved. So again, you don't want to willy-nilly just pick things and say, oh, this is a trade secret, that's a trade secret. Now, I think your listeners all know this, but although you can claim trade secret for the identity of the chemical, the hazard must be disclosed. So,
Mm-hmm.
you can come up with a generic name, you can make it as garden weed variety as you can, some polyethylene polymer, for example. But then you have to talk about the hazard. You can't not talk about the hazard, even though it is a trade secret. So again,
Right.
understanding these things and having a policy around them within your work processes and your policies in the regulatory department is what makes all of these 50 shades of gray, maybe 30 shades of gray.
Right. One less to deal with, or a few less to deal with
There you
along
go.
the way. Right. Right. And then you touched upon this a little bit too, the navigating different countries' requirements, the adaptations of these rules and regulations. Do you know why we have different country GHS rules and regulations?
Oh my goodness. When the globally harmonized system came out, we were all excited. Well, finally, everything's going to be harmonized. Well, then, no, that didn't quite happen. And, brief history of GHS, it was come up, the United Nations came up with GHS, as we all know. And what they allowed for was a modular system. It is a framework. It is not a legally binding regulation for the whole world, right?
Hmm.
And there are bits and pieces, building blocks, we call, that countries can choose to use or not use. So, what is a building block? Hazard classes, hazard categories. These are all building blocks, right? And GHS allows for different countries to either choose to implement all of them, some of them, part of them, right? And this is based on the different use scenarios of different chemicals, right? There are different
Hmm.
sectors, and the four sectors we talk about are transportation, workplace, what's the other one? Consumer and agriculture.
Hmm.
So, depending
Right.
on how your chemical and its hazards play out in these different environments, allows a country or a region to come up with their own um, set of GHS regulations and guidance for their country. So that's why, even though we are harmonized,
Hmm.
now if you choose
Right.
to adopt a building block, let's say some hazard class, you are allowed to choose, pick and choose, but you can't not implement everything within that hazard that GHS mandate, right? So again, being able to reconcile, what am I doing in my different countries? What are the differences
Hmm.
between the different countries and how am I complying? Because as a company, you don't want to have wildly different SDSs that are not consistent in some way. Of course, they have to be compliant with the country specific requirements, but they also have to meet your company's policy on
Right.
disclosure and classification.
And I would imagine there too, you've got potentially with some of your departments, like your marketing group, or somebody that wants to be like, well, why are we saying it's so hazardous? What's this nasty pictogramma that I have, and how come we don't say this in in European Union, for example, navigating that too and explaining why that is, right? A challenge
Right.
that we as authors face out there.
Yeah. I mean, within our 16 sections, we all know that sections 12 through 15 are not required.
Right.
They're
In
not
the U.S.,
mandatory
it's quite
in
a
the US.
right
Yeah.
in the U.S. It's a challenge here,
It's just
and
like,
you know,
what? Yeah.
what do I do? And
Yeah.
Europe will be like, get out of here with
Yeah.
this. We don't have
Yeah.
anything like that. You
Yeah.
need to, and not only that, it's your consumer use of the product versus the workplace
Right.
use.
Right.
And how do you juggle those two there? So,
Yeah.
yeah, some interesting things to look out for when dealing with multi-country use of your product. So.
There's also the nuance of translations, right? You can come up with, an SDS for a country, but then it has to be in that country's language of instruction. And sometimes technical translations are not the same as hello, how are you in Korean or Chinese, right?
You're right.
Technical translations are serious things. Once I tried to get a colleague to translate an English SDS to a different language. And they said, oh man, I don't know how to do this. You got these weird hazard classifications. I don't know how to translate that into, I forget what the language was. I think it was Arabic. They're like, no, I give up. So again, when you have these country adaptations, don't forget the translation aspect, you
Right.
know. Going to a reputable agency that can do this for you and get it right so it doesn't distort the meaning because the translation was somehow not quite right, that's
Right.
important to watch out for as well.
Yeah, we see that too with using colloquialisms or jargon or something that's, very loose language versus technical.
Right,
And these are absolutely technical documents. You want to have actual communication being done about the hazard. Now, if you're saying something that doesn't make sense, then yeah, you could be in trouble with that. So I totally agree. Makes, very important to have proper technical translators that know the actual technical word for it versus colloquial or jargon or, whatever slang you're going to use for something,
Right.
right?
Yeah. The SDS is not a good place to be using slang. Don't
No,
recommend it.
not at all. No, no.
It would be a
And
fun
I think
document to read, but yeah, no.
probably not right. And I think one good thing is you, as our listeners probably know, is that GHS does have harmonized. That's one part of that's lucky. Harmonized in multiple languages. I believe what 2025
Yeah.
languages like
Give or
EU
take.
and
Yeah.
give or take, right?
Yeah.
So that's very good. At least we have that to start with as
Yeah.
our, building blocks for languages. Um, what are some of the other things we should be watching out when managing other SDSs from various countries?
Yeah. Some of the things that, I've run into is the data expectations, right? So
Hmm.
not every section, for example, in section 2 for CLP, you are required to have the UFI, the unique formula identifier, right? If it's a hazardous substance. Now you don't need that for the US. That's a
Right.
completely different thing, right? So understanding the different requirements for the different sections is important because
Hmm.
if you're comfortable selling in one country, let's say, and you have geographic growth or you did an acquisition or something, and now you need to be able to provide SDSs for that country or countries in the different languages, well, then now you have a problem because you may not have all that data. Or even if you do have the data, you're not sure if it's reliable, right? So watching out for what may I need in the future based on my company's growth and
Hmm.
objectives in terms of where they want to market is important, right? So that you can be prepared. So yeah, I think understanding the different sections and what's required, the poison center notifications, those were due by the end of last year. Hopefully you were paying attention and that got done by most people. But again, knowing what are the different timelines for all the different country adaptations is important because otherwise you're going to be behind and you're going to be out of compliance. So
Sure. Sure. Okay. Good to know. And I think, just keeping up with one country's regulations is a challenge, let alone multiple countries. So I would imagine, some places to look for good courses in that. Here's a quick plug. I am a member, and you are too, of the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication, a great source of information and coursework, professional development courses on these types of things. So country-specific formats, how to do these classifications based on these specific building block approaches. I think it's a good thing to know if you are actually having the responsibility to do these in your workplace. So keep that in mind, and we'll have more information about it in our bio and on our website. So take a look at that. Moving on,
another let me
yeah,
let me
go ahead,
continue on the country. If
please.
you don't have in-house people who know how to do this, it is
Hmm.
always a good idea to invest in software that has templates, which is what we've done at Michelman, because the
Okay.
templates, help you because they're pre-populated with the algorithms and the rules. They help you come up with at least a format is easy because it's built in. But it's
Mm,
helpful to have that. If you don't have that, well, maybe it's time to go to a professional SDS authoring company to help you. Because I know in-house, a lot of smaller companies struggle with how do I keep up, right? I only know how to do maybe US, CLP, and maybe Canada. I don't
mm,
quite know
mm.
how to do other things. Well, then, there is people that can help you, software or consultants, reach out to them because it is not worth making a mistake the hard way, copying and
Right.
pasting. And I hope this works.
Oh.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We don't do that.
Yeah, it's too important not
Yeah,
to
yeah.
have a knowledge
The
base
the
behind it.
risk of someone getting hurt, having incorrect data, that lands you in trouble and hurts somebody. That is a serious thing. So
Oh, yeah,
you don't want to go there.
absolutely. No, no. And I think we touched a bit on this with the too much or too little data that's out there. Anything else we should be touching on and being aware of for this?
I think for safety data sheets, my preference is to give just enough and not have it be the be all and the end all of my product. It is at
Okay.
the end of the day a safety document, right? It is
Hmm.
designed to talk about the hazards. I know at one company I worked at, they wanted to add all kinds of regulatory information in section 15. And
Hmm.
I was sort of against that because I said, you can put it on there, because you can, but do you want to? Because now you have to manage extra data, which
Hmm.
if it changes or gets updated or becomes obsolete, you now have another set of things that you have to watch out for and revise your SDSs. So I think understanding how the SDS is used and being very circumspect about what data you put on there is key. And don't just
Sure.
stick everything in there in section 15 because you can. Nobody
Right.
will stop you, but not a good idea if you don't want to have to revisit your SDSs every time something changes. So,
And I would imagine legal would have something to say too about what you're putting in there as well,
I
right?
mean, it is a legal document. It is
Yeah.
a publicly available legal document on company letterhead.
Right.
So being very thoughtful about what you put on there is key, right? To
Hmm.
maintaining the black and white compliance as
Yeah.
best you can. You don't want to get
Yeah.
into the gray, right?
Exactly. Another point there, right? Hopefully, we're getting down to what, about 25 shades now
Yeah.
by now? Good, good. I think that's helpful. That's what you got to be aware of. It's not so black and white here in what we're doing. With that, you had talked earlier about the concept of mergers and acquisitions and what kind of headaches we may face there. What can one expect with those types of challenges?
Well, we need to do a separate podcast on that alone, given that
Okay.
I am a seven-time survivor. But yeah, jokes aside, M&As are stressful things, right? And what I found in my experience is a lot of times regulatory has come, we don't have a seat at the table when the discussions are happening on, oh, here's the target company, here's what we want to do. We're just not there, right? So the first thing is what I did is I hustled for a seat at the table. And this was because we had acquired a company, and again, I'm not going to mention any names, and the company we had acquired was a very small mom and pop shop based in Europe, and we had acquired them as a US based company. And when we looked at their data and their SDSs, it was terrible. And it was quite a feat in getting them updated, corrected. And of course, during the process of updating and correcting, we couldn't sell a lot of materials because the safety data sheet was wrong, right? So
Mhm.
after the acquisition, when everybody was like, Sonia, how come we can't sell these things? Why are you putting a block on it? Well, the SDS is not ready. Well, why the hell isn't it ready? Because they were selling stuff. Yeah, they were selling stuff only in Europe, but they weren't selling stuff in the US. And their SDS was not up to snuff, right? We couldn't find substantiation for data. We didn't have TSCA information. Sometimes the information we had, I think there was a polymer exemption that was listed. We had no data
Mhm.
to substantiate that. So what I'm trying to say is when you have an M&A, there are lots of nasty surprises that you can potentially find after the M&A happens. And when that happens, you are the roadblock between your commercial folks who are dying to sell and get the synergy, right, from the
Mhm.
acquisition. Yet here you are saying, yeah, not so fast, dude. There is a problem, right? And what are some of the problems? In this particular example, they did not have safety data sheets for the US. And of course, our company wanted to start selling these European made products into the US. And for
Oh.
the ones that they did have SDSs, they were wrong or
Mhm.
incorrect, right? So looking at what M&A activity is coming up in your company's future is a good thing to ask routinely. The company that I was at routinely did acquisitions.
Okay.
So for me, it was one of those things, hey, do we have anything that's coming up? Let me know. Um, I will sign all the disclosures, NDAs and everything, but I need to know what we're getting into. The sophistication level of who you're acquiring matters. Um,
Mhm.
their prowess in hazard communication and understanding thereof matters, right? Being able to ask all the right questions, having a seat at the table early matters, right? So I think all of these things are headaches that I've literally had to live with. And again, it's not for the faint of heart because, think about it this way. Regulatory people, HASCOM people are not generally the most popular in a
Right.
chemical company,
Mhm.
right? But that is for good reason, right? And when an M&A happens, usually there's a lot of excitement. Oh, we acquired this company, blah, blah, blah. You are that person who's like, yeah, there's a problem. And that's not something anybody likes, right? So
Right.
being able to predict and look ahead and proactively identify some of the things that might happen um, ahead of an acquisition is really important. So you can prepare your company and especially the commercial folks on, hey, I need to know this. And one of the
Hmm.
first things that needs to happen when you acquire a company is you have to redo the acquired company's SDSs with your company's logo and name and
Right.
details and all of that. Even that is work unto itself. And you're
Sure.
not usually, when you have an acquisition, again, it depends on the scale, but it could be thousands of SDSs, right? So you have your base work, your regular day-to-day work that you're doing, and then you have all these thousands of SDSs that now need to be updated, right? And before you update, what do? You look at the data, you look at how old it is, you look at the
Mm.
format. That, work is huge, right? So as you embark on that, it is helpful to let your superiors know that, look, this is a lot of work, and here's all the things I need to do, and here's all the potential problems we may have. So having a seat at the table, being involved in the due diligence is really important. Asking all the questions about the raw materials that go into this company's products is important because if they don't have the raw material information that you're going to use to base your HAZCOM classifications on, well, that's not going to work, right? So there's a
Right.
whole chain of things that questions that you need to ask. And I know for my previous company, I had a whole checklist of HAZCOM things I need to ask.
Oh,
So
wow.
if there are listeners who know that there's going to be acquisitions coming up, I encourage you to think about what are all the things I'm going to need to know when this happens, preferably know it before it happens, and how am I going
Yeah.
to handle it? Who's going to do
Yeah.
the work? Who's going to be my focal
Mhm.
point? Where's all the data? How am I going to get it? Right? How am I going to decide, if this is accurate or good enough? Can I trust it?
Mhm.
Is the
Those.
philosophy, is the HASCOM philosophy that this company used the same as our philosophy? Maybe it isn't. Maybe they like to disclose everything. Maybe your company is a little more prudent, right? So all of these things need to come together as one under that integrated company, your
Right.
company, if you're the
Right.
acquiring company.
Right. So you mentioned the fact of having the seat at the table, and with the company that was doing pretty much their day to day was M&A
Mhm.
activities, did you ever run into, and I would imagine that's the case, not having that initial seat at the table, but having to fight your way, or at least make the case why you should be at the table, and what have you done to
Absolutely.
make that happen? Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. So the first, I did not have a seat at the table. I didn't even know
Okay.
what was happening. When an acquisition happened and they said, okay, well, now we want to sell this product, I'm like, I don't have an SDS. What do you mean?
Mhm.
Just ask them. Okay. So we asked, and there was no SDS. This is the example
Oh.
I alluded to earlier, Europe and US. And they're like, what do you mean?
Uh,
So I'm
hmm.
like, well, you never told me. I didn't know. So that happened. And then subsequently, there was another M&A that I knew was going to happen. And I had said, look, this is what happens when you don't give me or someone on my team a seat at the table. If you
Mhm.
want to keep repeating this problem, then that's fine. Ignore us. I
Yeah.
can't do anything, dude.
Right.
There's not, I don't have a magic wand. People
Right.
who work with me know that that's my favorite line. I don't have a magic wand. I am not God. I can't do this, and make it
And make it
happen.
happen.
Right. So
Right.
sometimes, once an M&A is done badly from the HASCOM
Mhm.
perspective, that's a really good lesson for the superiors and people who are pursuing the M&As to say, yeah, we need to involve Sonia or HASCOM or whoever. So yeah, the first time when it went really badly, and it went really badly, after that it didn't happen again. So
Okay.
it's that whole adage of you have to get burned by the fire to know not to do it again.
Not to do
And
it
and
again.
that's what happened in our experience.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I would imagine once you have that table and you have the ear of the proper stakeholders at your firm, that makes this going a lot easier. But I like you mentioned, had you at the table, they probably maybe would have delayed the acquisition until they had the right data, or
Yeah. Or
whatever the case may be.
they wouldn't have promised products to customers that they couldn't sell to because the SDSs were not ready or were wrong
Right.
or not quite. You don't
Mm.
want to put your name on an SDS that is so. Because they did
Right.
say, well, why can't we just, cut and paste our name on theirs? I'm like, you can. I'm not going to sign off on it because I don't trust the data.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I'm going to have a lawyer, be
Exactly. And
signing
I,
this.
I, yeah. Right.
Yeah. So again, it's a risk decision, right? If the
Mm.
company is willing to take the risk of trusting that SDS, despite, your regulatory people telling you this is not quite right, okay, but you need to document that. Everything comes
Yep.
down to risk, right? What risk is the company willing to take? What hit
Right.
might your reputation take? I am an
Right.
advisor as a regulatory person. I am
Hmm.
not, calling the shots on risk if that's what they want to do. So again,
Right.
knowing, what you need to advise and then backing off and making sure that, you've said your piece and you let them do what they need to do.
Right. And document, 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 right? What you're
Yep.
doing.
DYA
Because
maneuver. DYA.
CYA. Exactly, exactly. And yeah, back in the days when I was in charge of hazardous waste management and shipments of hazardous waste, I had to sign those manifests. And,
Okay.
in school, I learned that once you sign that thing, you are known colloquially as the designated jailee. So
Yes.
great,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah, I,
So
I
to
keep
this day, I
saying I
have.
don't look good in orange and silver bracelets that don't unlock, you know.
Yeah, it doesn't match nicely. That's not
No,
my
not
fashion
not not a
style,
good
right?
look. Not
So,
a good look. No.
but yeah, I can see that, and it's the same way with this. You are putting your name in section one. You become, the owner of that liability.
Yeah.
So you better have a good team together, such as yourself, to advise and go with that in that case. So. But yeah, all those problems we spoke about earlier in the M&A process, old data, data that's incomplete, how do you, it's like a marriage, really. It's, what do you know about the other person that you're about to, hold hands with and take on a new life together.
It's so funny you said that. I actually did a product stewardship talk on M&As are like marriages. That was the title. Seriously.
Oh, really?
And I talked about how, you're scoping out, your partner and, you want to make sure you make a good decision. So this is a marriage made in good business heaven, so it's so odd that you mentioned that. That it was my whole talk was on M&As and how marriage are very similar.
Oh, nice. I got to catch that some one of these days. That's great. Awesome. We're on the same wavelength. See?
We are.
Well, some other things that we encounter, certainly out in the world of the greatness is the issue of using an SDS for a consumer use or maybe the article. What kind of issues do we have there with those concepts?
So, for articles, an SDS is really not required,
Right,
right? I mean, they're exempt. Same thing with non-hazardous material, but it is an industry expectation. Um,
right.
you have one. So
Yep,
there are the rules and then there are the expectations. And same thing with
right.
consumer products. I think for B2C type of entities, business to consumers and B2Bs, there is a vast difference in how sensitive you have to be. Because when you're providing SDSs for industrial workers, B2B businesses, they're a little bit more savvy in understanding this kind of data because they're supposed to be trained and go through all these types of HASCOM training and sign off and all that. For consumers, it's a little bit different. It's lay people, not like
Hmm.
you and me who are entrenched in this world. It's just
Hmm.
grandmothers and children and other folks who are minding their own business and buying things, right? So
Right.
there is a different level of rigor that's required and a different understanding of what is required because the target audience is less savvy or sophisticated in interpreting things. I think
Mm.
being very judicious, if you've always worked in a B2B business and suddenly you move to a B2C and now you're authoring for a different audience, knowing that, okay, I got to be a little bit different, in how I approach my work, I think that recognition is important.
Sure. Did you find, like, especially in the US, we've been tackling, I know at the SCHC, we've been hoping to have one day a talk by the Consumer Product Safety Commission and somebody from OSHA, and
Hmm.
how, if anywhere, we can get harmonization, right? And I think talking to that, are we ever going to see something like that? I've seen labels out there. You can go to the local hardware store and see a pictogram. Is mom and pop going to know what that means, or what, you know, we're used to very simple labeling on a consumer product, but I bring that into my workplace and now it's handled as something else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things where we can hope, but
Hmm.
this isn't a new problem. We've had this
Right,
problem for a while. And then now,
right,
when you have products being sold online, again, you don't know who's buying what and doing what, how they're using
right.
it. So this to me is a pretty serious thing that I wish would get some resolution sooner rather than later. Um,
Yeah.
but we'll see.
Yeah, it's the nature of I think, our governmental structure here, where, and I've used this metaphor that these are different kingdoms, right? OSHA is a
Yeah.
kingdom, EPA is a kingdom, CPSC is their own. They don't like to talk
Yep.
to each other. They like to rule their own, land, right? And
Yeah.
they don't want to talk. That's why we have optional sections in our SDSs, right? So
Right.
I'm hoping, like you, that we get some, you know, interpretation on that we can get to a one label means one thing to all people, but hard thing to tackle at
Well,
this point.
Europe is actually trying to do that with their one substance, one assessment philosophy.
Hmm.
They're trying to do
Uh-huh.
that. So this is under the EU Green Deal and Chemical Strategy for Sustainability. So that is something they've discussed because this discrepancy doesn't help,
Okay.
right? It's the same
Okay.
chemical, but different companies, not different companies, excuse me, different authorities are regulating it differently. The hazards are the same. The
Hmm.
physical properties are the same.
Right.
So different
Right.
testing requirements, different data submission requirements. It makes no sense, right? So this proliferation
Right.
of sometimes duplicate work and contradicting not assessments but philosophies of managing
Mm.
regulations is
Uh-huh.
not good for anyone. It causes more
No.
confusion where at the end of the day
Right.
you want to have regulations that make it clearer, right? What's mandatory
Right.
versus not mandatory. So I do
Right.
appreciate that Europe is trying to, come up with this one substance, one assessment policy. It's a couple of years away. I haven't heard that
Okay.
it's imminent, but it is being talked about.
Okay.
So maybe,
Oh, great.
US can take a clue from what's happening on the other side. But it is a good development. Let's just put it that way. Maybe someday it'll
Oh,
happen
that's
for us
great.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that there is something out there. It's not just sitting in dead space. So good.
Well, in the
Great.
US, I think it is sitting in dead space, but in Europe, it is not. So
Right. So hopefully, like you said, the U.S. can learn from our friends over the past the pond, right? Over
there
the
you go.
pond. Another issue here we've seen is, this whole world of hazard communication. SDS is just one piece of that. Of course, based on that, we create container labels, right? And I'm sure we have some issues there with our labeling and what we can do with that, and where is the grayness in that aspect?
Well, sometimes the regulators who come up with the regulations and in practice, when you look at awkward shaped packages or small packages, you're going to need to have super hearing and not super hearing, super sight to be able to see things on a yay big packet, right?
Right.
So again, it's one thing to be aspirational about having rules around, what you need to put on the labels. It's another to find that it's not practical. So
Sure.
sometimes in practice, it just doesn't work. So again,
Mhm.
there's another discrepancy where, yes, you're asking me to do this, but if I do all of this, no one's going to be able to read it. There's no space. There's a real estate
Right.
problem, right? On some of our package labels, there just isn't enough
Right.
space. So then, what do you do? I know that I think it's in China. They are coming up with QR codes
Hmm.
where rather than putting all the information, important information on your label, there's a QR code that you can scan, and then all the information will show up in some site that it'll take you to. So maybe that's the new world where resolving this real estate problem with adequate warning and labeling is we take care of technology, or we avail the technology that's ready for us to use.
Right.
So
Okay.
that might be another thing that we can aspire to.
Great. Great. What about training for the hazard communication? Employers are responsible for doing this. What do we have that can ensure we have effective training in this, in hazard communication?
Right. So I think, understanding that this is a requirement is the first thing. I think a lot of the smaller companies, people come in, they're hired, do your job, here's how you do it, and then that's it. And the training piece happens ad hoc. It is not
Mhm.
a formal training like, that employers do. And that's a shame, right? You don't want to
Right.
have a problem to then say, oh, yeah, I didn't quite have a program, right? So knowing that if you're dealing with hazardous chemicals, especially, you are required, by the competent authority to have a training program is the first thing. I always have told my company that whenever you hire someone, especially if they're in the manufacturing and operational space, this needs to be part of their onboarding.
Hmm.
There needs to be a sign off, there needs to be tracking, there needs to be, a timestamp, all of these good things. And being diligent about it, refreshing it, because our GHS regulations are not static. They're not never going to change, right? So I
Right.
remember back in 2015 when
Hmm.
we went live with GHS in the US. At the time, I was supporting 7, 8 plant. I can't remember now. But we
Hmm.
had a whole full blown up program on, what is it that you need to understand, what can you do, what can't you do when you ship, materials out. We had 2 layers of checks to make sure there were GHS. So again, that was part of training. If I don't tell you what you can and can't do, if I can't tell you how to evaluate an SDS when you're, doing your work, what is the point of having these documents? If you don't know where to
Right.
find it, and if you have no idea, that this says it's 20 years old, yeah, maybe I should ask for, a more updated version. Maybe nothing has changed, that's fine. But
Mhm.
again, being thoughtful about equipping your people to look for things that make them say, is this
Right.
SDS accurate? Is this SDS correct? Can I find this SDS? Emergency response. What happens if there's a need for that? When
Right.
contractors come in, you need to make sure you have, some provision for training them on whatever it is they're doing, especially
Right.
if there's a HAZCOM component, right? So training, the
Mm.
awareness is the first thing, and then it's top down, right? You need to
Right.
have that safety culture where management says, "I shall not bring someone in to work with hazardous materials without making sure these steps are taken," and some sort of a,
Sure.
audit process or feedback. You don't want to wait
Right.
to have something happen, right? Not for the reputational and societal aspect, but these are human beings. We care about them,
Right.
right? So you
Right.
you want to have that integrity in your company's uh, DNA, right? To do
Sure.
the right thing and have that training program.
Yeah, the overall safety culture should be in place that you are proactive about this instead of the reactive that we
Yeah,
tend to see in a lot of this. But great.
yeah. And in some
Well, I
companies,
think
I've
we.
seen I'm sorry. In
Yeah.
some
No, no,
companies,
no,
I've
please.
seen
Good.
where HAZCOM doesn't talk to EH&S, and that's a
Hmm.
shame because those two are connected somewhat at the hip. Because if
Right.
you are creating safety data sheets for your products, you've updated something, you want to make sure there's a feedback loop of letting your EH&S folks know that, hey, if they're still using paper files, hey, throw out this one and replace it with that one or a new one.
Right.
If
Right.
hopefully they're using an electronic system, then there's a mechanism of notifying them to make sure they're familiar with whatever new hazards perhaps that might have now show up on the SDS that previously did not
Right.
exist. or maybe with new
And that is a
classifications,
requirement.
right, that is a
Mm,
requirement, right? So
mm.
having that connection between the HASCOM people and the EH&S people is important. Otherwise, this
Oh
training
yeah.
thing is going to fall flat.
Right. And it's not a static thing. Again, new chemicals being brought into the workplace,
Hmm.
new hazards with the chemicals you already have, those have to be conveyed and communicated to your end user. So, absolutely, that's one of those low-hanging things which I keep telling people. Why is it every year that our top five,
Yes.
number one, number two is always HASCOM? Always,
Yes.
it's the lowest hanging fruit
Oh,
that you
yes.
find at a facility.
Yep. Yep.
So with that, Sonia, we've covered some excellent topics here. I'm hoping we brought to light some areas of gray and made them hopefully a little bit more black and white for us. But excellent topics to go through. Where can we find more about this information? Where do you think? I think you mentioned perhaps the AIHA or Product Stewardship Society, some other good sources. Do you have any other
Obviously,
recommendations?
obviously SCHC, if you subscribe to various SDS software, I'm not going to name
Hmm.
anything because I don't
Sure.
think I'm allowed. There are some that I work with. They
Hmm.
routinely provide updates on, what's happening in the different jurisdictions with respect to GHS changes.
Sure.
Monitoring, the federal registrar, OSHA's
Hmm.
communications is a really good idea.
Sure.
Just knowing what areas of the world you play in and
Hmm.
looking out for um, publications that are a good source is helpful.
Hmm.
And if anybody wants, a list, I can certainly give that to them. I don't think I should be mentioning any vendors here.
Sure.
But I
Sure.
certainly have my favorites, and I'm sure a
Ah,
lot of the listeners have theirs, and you must have yours.
oh
But I
yeah,
can share
absolutely.
that offline if anybody's interested.
Fantastic. Yeah, and Sonia is a great resource for all these and much more. One thing I was interested in when you brought up the fact that at one time you had some questions to ask before or during an M&A, right? I think some of our listeners would love to see what was your thought process in developing that questionnaire list. And it's a great, I think, we want to say maybe cheat sheet or tool to use if you're ever facing the M&A world or even just anything in your HASCOM world. So I want to thank you again for joining us today, Sonia, and please look at her bio for information on how to reach her. We look forward to having you on as a guest again very soon.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye bye.